Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's program. My name is Yonit Behar, and I'm the assistant curator at the DePaul Art Museum here in Chicago. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I see many new faces as well as familiar faces here today, so welcome everyone. Even though today is January 21st, it really feels like the year is just starting. So I'm beyond excited to start this new year with today's workshop, Coming to Terms, organized by Raquel Gutiérrez and Risa Puleo. With today's workshop, we are launching a series of public programs planned in conjunction with our exhibition Latinx American that opened virtually on January 7th and will open physically to the public as soon as we are safe to do so. On February 4th, we have a conversation with Arlene Davila and El Morales, moderated by Billy Johnson Gonzalez, about Latinx inclusivity. And on February 25th, Ondine Chaboya will be talking about queer networks in Latinx art and many more programs that you can check out. I am very grateful to both Raquel Gutiérrez and Risa Puleo to have accepted this invitation to lead this workshop and for taking the time to talk to me in the preparation for it. Their selection of readings, as you saw, was incredible, and I'm ready to hand it over to them. Raquel and Risa will first engage in a short conversation amongst them, and then there will be the workshop, and lastly, we'll have time for a very brief Q&A. So now let me introduce you to our guests. Raquel Gutiérrez works as a poet and arts writer, working through ekphrases as one way to reflect upon queer brown life in the arts in the Southwest borderlands. Raquel is a 2017 recipient of the Creative Capital and the Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant. They work in a range of topics that have continued to inform their writings and teaching, including critical race theory, queer, Latinx aesthetic, and performance art in the Americas. Their poetry and essays have appeared or are forthcoming in NPR Music, Los Angeles Review of Books, The New Inquiry, Fence, Wisache, the Georgia Review, the Texas Review, and Poetry Foundation. Raquel's first book of prose, titled Brown Neon, will be published by Coffee House Press in the fall of 2022. And Raquel's first book of poetry, Southwest Reconstruction, will be published by Noemi Press in 2022. Risa Puleo is an independent curator. Her exhibition, Walls Turned Sideways, Artists Confront the American Justice System, was curated for the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. She also curated Monarchs, Brown and Native Contemporary Artists in the Path of the Butterfly, for Bemis Center for Contemporary Art during her years as curator in residence, traveled through the summer of 2019 to MoCA, North Miami, Blue Star Art Space, Southwest School of Art and Craft in San Antonio, and the Neiman Art Museum in Kansas City. Other exhibitions have been hosted by the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York City, Franklin Street Works in Stanford, Art Pace San Antonio, and more. Puglio has a master's degree from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College and Hunter College, and is a doctoral candidate in Northwestern University in the art history program. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Raquel and Risa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us here tonight. And thank you so much to everybody who's in the audience. It's really nice to see some artists who were in Monarchs and also some artists that I know from other places like Texas. I'm going to start out tonight by talking about a little bit about my half of the conversation that Raquel and I have been having since about 2017, maybe even before, and that my half of the conversation coincided with the making of this exhibition called Monarchs, Brown and Native Artists on the Path of the Butterfly. And at a certain point, and I know that there are many writers and people making works in all sorts of mediums in the audience, there's a point in that process where you need to define your terms. And this was a particularly important part of the process for me because Monarchs was unique in that it was bringing two groups of artists who are historically not shown together. It would be Native American, and then and at the end of the day, I kind of opened up the umbrella to this larger category of indigenous to the Americas that was inclusive of immigrants, people with an immigrant experience to the United States, but then also people like myself, maybe like many of us who were born with citizenship and are still also indigenous to the Americas in some capacity, but may not be an immigrant, may not be Native American. So with a lot of this thinking across these terms of identity, it became really important to be very specific about which terms I was going to be employing. And that led me to a process of reading many of the texts that we shared with you for this evening. I also have to apologize for a moment because I did all of this work to go in and annotate my texts and put that one of them was written by Jared Sexton, another was Jose Munoz, and then all of that apparently disappeared when I sent it. So I'm sorry if that was really confusing to figure out who read what, and we'll be sure to sort of identify who wrote each of these texts. So the process of like coming to terms, so to speak, was, I mean, I think is always maybe fraught, and we can all kind of attest to that in our own associations with specific terms to identify ourselves in the world. But then it also, and the political ramifications around that. And what I was finding is a sort of genealogy. Like one of the texts that we're going to talk about, I believe first, is by Octavio Paz, who in 1985 cannot imagine any other word other than Hispanic being the word that unites the people of the Americas. I think we think differently about that word now. And so what I was finding is a genealogy, and with a genealogy, this problem of like how you insert yourself into a history. So I'll leave it at that and pass it over to Raquel, because I'm sure we're going to be thinking about a lot of these questions as we continue together.
Yeah, and to sort of help contextualize the space of our conversation too, Risa, I'd like to just offer the space here. A greeting and my own acknowledgement. I'm here in Tucson, Arizona, in the unceded lands of the Tohono O'odham people, and smack in the middle of the Southwest, 60 miles north of the US-Mexico border, on the first day where construction has not taken place along the border space here in southern Arizona, northern Mexico. And to also offer a bit of our origin narrative and how Risa and myself met one another. I met Risa in Texas, in San Antonio, at the With Land exhibition that Risa had curated, the artist Rafa Esparza and the different artists that had come on the opening evening of his show at Art Pace Contemporary Arts Museum in San Antonio, which was the first time I had been to that museum space. And for, I think, the purpose of our conversation here too, I just want to have an opportunity to meditate on sort of the relational nature of the nomenclature of these terms, right? These terms of engagement, but also these terms that are grounded in a desire for collectivity and belonging, but also fraught with their own sort of state-sanctioned, state-sponsored energies, right? And the ways in which these dynamics animate my own anxieties, right? In the constellation that we are working with today. So with that said, yeah, language and Hispanicisms, but the term on the table here is Hispanic.
Raquel, I'm going to share the questions that we have.
Yes.
These are just sort of prompts to keep in mind throughout. They're not directed towards any of the specific terms, but what we thought we would do was go through one by one. We have a couple of questions for each, and we'd love for anybody who maybe feel strongly, positively or negatively about a certain term to speak up and to talk about that alliance or disavowal, and how the text may have changed your relationship to it. I'm going to also put these questions in the chat. So what are the stakes of these different ethno-political identities used to describe artists and their work? How does language bring us together across race, nationality, gender, and how does it keep us apart? What naming strategies allow for the specificity of intersectionality within the unity necessary for political mobility? So those are just some guiding questions as we sort of move forward. And Hispanic, I wonder, I'm gonna try to share my screen. Can everybody see Mr. Paz on the page?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. I circled it. So in 1984, this is a exhibition catalog called Hispanic Art in the United States. He writes, concerning this term Hispanic, what should we call the various Spanish American communities living in the US? The Chicanos, the Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Central Americans, and so on. It seems to me that the only common term, Hispanic, covers all of them in their complex unity. And part of his reason behind this is because they all share Spanish language. I'd love to hear from anybody about what they think about Hispanic. And I'd also love to think about what happens outside of the space of language when we think beyond language as a sort of unifying factor. What other sort of commonalities or differences could be used that Hispanic doesn't account for?
I'm happy to share something. Rafael Soldi here. I'm originally from Peru. I grew up there. I moved to the US about 15 years ago, and when I was 16. And I feel like the term Hispanic here in the US, something that I struggle with is my identity as a Latinx person when I'm in Peru versus my identity as a Latinx person when I'm here in the US. And those two things feeling like they have very different contexts. And I feel like Hispanic specifically is a term, to me at least, that's very tied to a specific generation. So I think when I moved to the US, we had already moved past using Hispanic as a term, or we were making our way past it. So I don't have a lot of strong kind of emotional reactions to the term, even though I don't use it personally. I feel like there are a lot of people, my parents spent a lot of time here when they were younger, and they have a very strong reaction to that word differently than I do. So I'm curious how, where you were, at what time affects how you relate to a certain term.
Thank you so much, Rafael, for sharing. I think you're talking about a sort of datedness that's coming across, but also site specificity or place specificity when you're talking about context changing across borders. And I believe that Hispanic is a word that comes up in the census in the 1970s, specifically under the Nixon era. And then kind of hits its stride as like in the 80s in sort of a multicultural moment. I think I have. Is there anybody else who would like to share?
I think for me, the issues that I have with Hispanic is that it's all based on language, right? Like it simplifies all the richness of the many cultures that exist in Latin America. And also in a way doesn't quite include Brazil, where they speak Portuguese, or in other parts of Latin America where Spanish is not the first language.
That's a great point. And I also think that by emphasizing Spanish, we also emphasize Spain as a connecting force, like a shared colonization.
Yeah.
In regard to the point you bring up in its emergence during the Nixon era, and to Rafael's point about strong feelings, and for me, the strong feelings signal some, a desire to resist that term Hispanic, and a desire to resist that term for the last 2 decades of a consciousness surrounding, my political investments and my community investments, and the ways in which Hispanic always registers as a means towards a proximity to respectability and power. And that's ultimately what, guides my desire to resist it.
This is Xochitl Solis from Saludos de Austin, Texas.
Hey, Xochitl.
Hi, Lisa. So good to see you.
Good to see you.
I guess, to me, the word Hispanic is not something that I identify. It's but it is really bureaucratic term. I think my mother, as a self-employed entrepreneur, really tied into the word Hispanic, because it was a term in the 80s when her business was thriving, where she could access funds and banking opportunities. So it's very tied to resources. And if the intention of having this really broad blanket term was indeed to be able to, in the best of its intentions, was to provide data and statistics towards communities' needs for services, I guess, in the larger scheme of federal social services and that. And then my father was an educator. So that also tied into just being also tying to resources for communities of students. So to me, it seems very, very structured without nuance, which really, as someone else mentioned, lacked the color and the vibrancy of each culture and homogenized it. So it's definitely a term that feels out of date, and also not being a Spanish speaker until my adult age, and even then struggling, having it related to language always felt a disconnect for me. So that's my relationship to the word.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Xochitl. I think that what you're saying really fills in a lot of the pieces between Raquel's kind of talking about the respectability politics and the power aspect of Hispanic, and then this other history of it being a demographic category that maybe also means it's tied to a sort of consumer base or fitting oneself within a market. I also think that let's keep Hispanic in mind, but we also have a lot of terms on the table. I think that we were going to pivot really nicely to Thomas Ibarra Fausto next. And I think after also figuring this information out about Hispanic, it makes even more sense to go to Tomas. You want to take over the screen, Raquel?
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and get us to my Word document. All right, so we have Rasguachismo. Another unit is entering the space. So Rasguachismo, a Chicano sensibility, Tomás Ibarra Frausto, and the paragraph in that I shared here in the realm of taste. To be rascuache is to be unfettered and unrestrained, to favor the elaborate over the simple, the flamboyant over the severe, bright colors. Chillantes are preferred to somber, high intensity, to low, the shimmering and sparkling over the muted and subdued. The rascuache inclination piles pattern on pattern, filling all available space with bold display. And just a few sentences down, paradoxically, while elaboration is preferred to understatement, high value is placed on making do. Hacer rendir las cosas. Limited resources means mending, refixing, and reusing everything. So, for me, I imagine for many in the space here, thinking about place, right? Thinking about space and thinking about, and rascuachismo ultimately enabling us to think about our first encounter with an aesthetic, right? At a community level, a shared experience of space, Chicano sensibility, in some ways informing a palpable aesthetic. And so the question that I'm trying to pull and have us think about is this idea of place, right? How does a sense of place inform your relationship to identity?
I wanted to respond to that with this idea of thinking of a place from different areas. So when you are in, I'm Karen Dana, I'm sorry, I'm from Mexico City. I'm talking from Chicago, where I live now. I'm based there. So thinking about place, as Rafael was mentioning, or language and words, when you're in the country that you were born or in the US is different. So I think of place, but at the same time, in all of these words, I find also displacement. So that's kind of like in every word, I feel like instead of unifying, it's marking the difference, like yeah, so it's not inclusive, it's exclusive.
Amazing. Thank you. You said your name was Karen?
Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic. And how long have you been in Chicago, if you don't mind me asking? I'm just trying to get a sense of who's in the space here.
I'm sorry?
Oh, how long have you been in Chicago?
I've been in Chicago 4 years. Before that, I was in New York for more than 10 years. So I've been in it for a little while.
Okay, so thinking about space and think about displacement. And okay.
And it really feels different actually from coming from New York and in Chicago. I feel like in New York, the nature of the place is diversity, and it's all, or at least how I lived it. Maybe those years were different than now, but it felt very much like everyone was dealing with the same things. And so it blended in, it all mixed up pretty well. And then here it feels more segregated.
All right. So to your point, Karen, about the feeling segregated, or what happens when we come to a new place, in the sense of, and why I'm really curious about rascuachismo and this sort of introduction to thinking about aesthetics. And this is a piece, that I recently shared that I'm having my students, my Introduction to Chicano Literature students read too, just because I also want them to imagine the settings of these literary representations that they're about to engage in. And for myself, as someone who, and I was joking with Risa earlier that, Risa's from Texas, I'm from California, I'm from Los Angeles. And I'm currently working on an essay, an ekphrastic memoir sort of exploration of that period in San Antonio where we met, and trying to make sense of these 4 Angeleños myself, Rafa Esparza, the artist, the performance artist, Sebastian Hernandez, and the punk rock ranchera chanteuse, Sancha. The four of us sort of being strangely perceived in the space of San Antonio with all of its really distinct histories, its sort of military presence, its Alamo-ness, and its sort of strange relationship to its own Tejano crux, right? Burdens of identity and burdens of history that city carries, and the ways in which, you know, our identities are always shifting and relational, but that the I don't know, there's something about Rascuachismo that allows for an itinerant experience of our identities. I'm eager to hear from other folks, and also in the interest of time, also totally fine with moving on.
I'll jump in. This is Sam Kirk. I'm based here in Chicago. I've lived in New York as well. I've been in New York for 4 years, but primarily I've lived in Chicago. It's always been a little bit tricky for me. I identify as biracial. My mother's Puerto Rican and Mexican. My father's Irish. And growing up in Chicago, I think with the segregation here, we've never felt connected really to the communities that we've lived in, because our family never really was part of the majority in any neighborhood. So in relation to my identity, I think a lot of who I am today has to do with how much we moved throughout the city. And we moved for a variety of reasons. A lot of it had to do with discrimination, mostly discrimination towards my mother, because she's Mexican and Puerto Rican, but she visibly looks like a Black woman. So in even communities where it was our own culture, like Little Village, I live in Little Village now, and my wife is Afro-Latina as well, and she deals with a lot of the same things that my mother did, just with discrimination from kind of her own people. We moved around a lot, so my identity has a lot to do with the various neighborhoods and cities that I've lived in, and probably a little bit less with the communities that I grew up that were actually part of my heritage and culture.
Sam, what's your practice?
I'm a visual artist. Mm-hmm. I do mostly paintings and large-scale murals.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
And Sam, Karen, and other people here are in the Latinx American show.
Fantastic. And so, yeah, that's great. I'm just like letting it all like sink in and not even sure how to respond to that, in the sense of, well, I'm definitely connecting to the point about receiving the brunt of just racist responses, feedback, treatment by the Latino community itself, right? The various different, you know, and in Chicago, the majority being Mexican, right? Mexican and Puerto Rican. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I imagine that there would probably be another program, but that is, you know, that might be an interesting segue into brownness and mestizaje.
Yeah, I was also going to say it might be a really interesting segue into people of colorness. Jared Sexton, which way do you want to go?
Well, I think in the sense of just holding accountable the ways in which Gloria Anzaldúa, and mestizaje and the mestiza consciousness, and sort of this awkward and it's awkward, but it also detracts from her border philosophy, this invocation of Jose Vasconcelos, and this sort of riff that she does on la raza cósmica, on the cosmic race, and mestizaje ultimately being touted as a space of like the ideal cosmic race, but it was always a plan for white supremacy, right? How to dilute Black and Indigenous blood with European, with the conquest, and you know, how does this conquest show up in everyday life? In the sense that, you know, mestizaje. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do you want to pull that text up? So
Yes, and so we have under this idea of ambiguity, a tolerance for ambiguity. These numerous possibilities leave La Mestiza floundering in uncharted seas. In perceiving conflicting information and points of view, she is subjected to a swamping of her psychological borders. She has discovered that she can't hold concepts or ideas in rigid boundaries. The borders and walls that are supposed to keep the undesirable ideas out are entrenched habits and patterns of behavior. These habits and patterns are the enemy within. Rigidity means death. And then the last paragraph, the new mestiza copes by developing a tolerance for contradictions, a tolerance for ambiguity. She learns to be an Indian in Mexican culture, to be Mexican from an Anglo point of view. Have you read much of Anzaldúa, Risa?
Yes, I've mostly the Birch Called My Back anthology, which also uses people of color.
And women of color, right?
Women
the
of color.
coalitional politics that comes from that bridge between the feminists and Combahee, the Combahee River Collective, and the mentors to Moraga and Anzaldúa in Tony Cade Bambara and Audre Lorde.
What about other people in the audience? What's your relationship with either mestizaje or Anzaldúa? I know she is a carrier of many people across that bridge.
I don't know if it's okay to just jump in.
Yeah, just jump
Please,
in.
yes.
Hi, I'm Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
I teach art history at the School of the Art Institute here in Chicago.
Hey, Daniel.
Yeah, I teach Anzaldúa. She's enormously important for all my students, many of whom have often read her before they take the class. You know, I think there's a something that I like that I felt was really threaded through this wonderful selection was a sense of intergenerational communication and maybe a kind of evolution of terms or a passing down of terms that really intrigues me. You know, I think hopefully we could think of these kinds of discussions as a productive confusion. Everyone's being very testimonial, so it's a little out of my generation, but I will. I'm half Puerto Rican. My father's from the island, and my mother is actually Spanish Jewish. So I always say Spanish are the bad guys in both sides of the family. The discourse around flexibility, or what was the exact line? Like a tolerance for contradiction. This language in Anzaldúa is fascinating to me because I think she's really trying to use these as terms or even symptoms of survival. You know, this is not, she doesn't talk about flexibility or what would soon be a fashionable term in her moment that she's writing this stuff, you know, hybridity. She's not speaking about those terms in any kind of light sense or in a post-Cold War celebratory sense of like, you know, a little bit of everything, right? But I am interested from a critical perspective in how there's almost this like troubling connection to that more neoliberal notion of flexibility, right? That on the one hand, Anzaldúa is really sketching terms for a subaltern subject, someone who is resilient because they have survived and will have to survive extraordinary injustice and the violence of the border, right? And then on the other hand, the way that our economic world has been changing, right? Has been increasingly demanding a certain kind of flexible subject. So that's just one thing that interests me. Maybe I relate to it, I don't know.
Fantastic, thank you, Daniel. What are there any sort of things that you can share as broadly as you can about why this text and why Anzaldúa is so meaningful to your students?
I think it's the sense of the personal, you know. Not all the theory that our students read appeals to who they are and gives them the permission to try to account for who they are, for their own history, in their learning. I think that's my guess. That's always been my sense as to why. If anything, Anzaldúa has almost risen in stature, has become just a touchstone, even for the entering undergraduates.
Yeah, I'm still not, it feels like she is ascending into some sort of canon space in the university, but I can't be sure. I mean, I think that is definitely the case in most art programs, art students, art schools, critical studies programs. But I wonder, I mean, I don't know about most English departments. And so from here, yeah, I'm interested in moving towards the text by Ren Ellis Neda, The Question of Ethics in the Semiotics of Brownness. Or we can go to the Brown Commons and start there, Risa.
We can do that. I'll take over. We kind of skipped over Chicano. Are we okay with that?
No, maybe we should go back to Chicano.
You want to go back?
Yeah.
So for Chicano, we're actually using the definition. Can everybody see? We're actually using the definition from Phantom Sightings, which coined the term Post-Chicano. Post-Chicano is also the sort of largest show before Monarchs. It was about 10 years, and then Monarchs was this sort of like kind of decade survey again for shifting terms in the context of Standing Rock, and at that moment a promise to build a border wall that has been partially realized. I felt like I was most contending with this idea of what a post-Chicano was, but here we're looking at the post-Chicanos definition of the Chicano as a usage problem. And within Chicano is wrapped up a sort of definition of the Mexican American. And so Chan Noriega actually starts with the American Heritage Dictionary, noting that Mexican American, it doesn't appear in the dictionary, but Chicano does, and they're suggested to be used interchangeably. So I think what we're talking about are sort of hyphenated identities that call upon nationhood, Cuban, Dominican, Puerto Rican, with more complicated nationhood, versus Chicano, which is a political category that has the impetus of a civil rights movement, a labor movement behind it, and had different, going back to place specificity, also had different registers in different places. As I remember, I'm very interested to read, Raquel, your meditation on when we met in San Antonio with these Los Angelinos, and San Antonio is my hometown, because one of the things that we talked about is how the Chicano movement was just more limited in Texas, and thus has a different kind, like Tejanas like myself have a different relationship to Chicanismo than maybe a Los Angelino, depending on also who your parents were, what their alliances were, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Chicano also a classed term, and a term that comes from the Chicano journalist Ruben Salazar, who worked at the Los Angeles Times, was a reporter and also the news director for the Spanish language news channel, but he was from El Paso, he's from El Paso, Texas. And so he has a piece from 1970 February that ran in the Times, sort of a polemic in the form of an op-ed. What do Chicanos want? What is a Chicano, and what is it that Chicanos want? And that the term comes from Chihuahua, right? The state of Chihuahua borders that part of Texas. And that it's a very poor Mexican is a Chicano, a very, very poor, someone who is perceived as an Indian, right? An uneducated person working in the fields. So it's it's interesting. It's a term that is supposed to humiliate.
So this is also really fascinating because that's a really different etymology than the one that I have learned, and I'm probably wrong. I thought that Chicano was adopted from a variation of Mexica, the pre-Alexander, like what the Mexica people of now better known as the Aztec because of Alexander von Humboldt called themselves, and that it was a sort of alliance to Mexica with the Chicano at the end, but I believe you.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also reiterated in the documentary Chicano, the civil rights movement for the Mexican American people that PBS put out in the, I think in 91 or 92. 92 was a big year. It was like the 500th, there was a lot of also NEA funding, right, that supported artists. Actually, I think it came out before 92. But you see people like Patsy Valdez, you see Harry Gamboa narrating their own experiences as high school activists who are partaking in the East Los Angeles walkouts. I had my students, we spent some time with that just to always be aware of the sort of the cultural dynamics and the historical context that will just underscore their experiences of these literary representations in our class. So yeah, I mean, that's fresh on the mind here in terms of Chicano, history of Chicano.
Yeah, I do think though that it's not only a class history or a class position, but it's also more likely a class that is less Spanish, more indigenous, that is a Chicano.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And that ties to Mexica in a roundabout way, but I shouldn't push that forward with my falsified etymologies.
It's being recorded, so.
I know. I'm wrong on camera.
Yeah, I'd be curious to have a few moments around post-Chicano. This in the sense, I was in Los Angeles when Phantom Sightings was developed, right, in Los Angeles. And I remember being really pleased with the sort of educational rollout of their materials, museum materials, and how to introduce concepts like space and abstraction to communities who probably had variously no relationship to the museum, right? Or no relationship to conceptual art. But I remember not really getting on board with post-Chicano.
Did anybody else live through the post-Chicano moment and have an experience with it?
The moment, the Mariah Carey moment. So it was in Los Angeles. It was in San Antonio. I remember when it was in San Antonio too.
I saw it there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was also probably an undergraduate. Mm-hmm. And I remember it being actually kind of a liberating idea that maybe that the sort of historical weight of Chicano was over and I could be something new. Mm-hmm. And that I think it was also a moment where I was incredibly playful around identity. Mm-hmm. and trying to assume different kinds of stances around identity. I remember being in a kind of moment where I was like, well, what if I assumed a sort of power that only patriarchy gives you? And, or assumed a kind of power that only like sort of whiteness only gives you. And what would that mean if I took it? So I think that I don't think I can even identify with those places anymore. And that feels very 2007, which I think is when Post-Chicano came out. And I was not an undergrad, so I'm conflating two time periods in my life. But I do think that there was, you know, I had worked at a Chicano art gallery, had been working with like some really amazing people. And I think that there's something incredibly powerful about being tied to the past as much as there is about being freed from it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm stuck on the historical weight, right? Being freed from the historical weight. Yeah, and then I think it traveled to, did it go to MUAC in Mexico City?
I believe so.
Yeah, I saw the ASCO show in MUAC, but I missed it in Los Angeles.
So we also could talk about hyphenated identities here, Mexican American, Cuban American, and also just Chicano in general. It doesn't have to be only post-Chicano.
You know, there's a question in the chat here that might be good to engage. Curious if there was a relationship to the freestyle show and the coinage of post-Black contemporary art from Daniel Quiles. And Nia is also wondering this as well. And
yeah, I also think that there's tied to sort of a post-feminism that was happening between 2000 and 2007, maybe even 98 to 2007. I wonder if Phantom Sightings is in fact a response to Thelma Golden and freestyle in a sort of post-Black moment, and trying to think through that language and trying to be a post-Chicano moment. Awesome. I don't know about that show. I'll have to go look it up. I think that also the interesting thing about this, what happens after Post-Chicano, is two things. We get Jose Munoz writing about brownness. And then maybe we also get the sort of seeds of a Latino first, and then what becomes a sort of Latinx over the course of a decade.
Great, I'm happy to share my screen here.
I'll get out of here. So I think we're going to talk about the criticism of Munoz more than Munoz.
Oh, I mean, if maybe. Let's see. So this is a really wonderful piece. These two pieces that I've been engaging with my students. This one, The Problem with Latinidad, excuse my scrolling. It's a round table conversation with 5 different sort of millennial era thinkers, writers, organizers, activists. And this piece in particular, this paragraph, is from the poet and writer Alan Pelaez Lopez, queer, non-binary, Oaxacan, black Oaxacan, undocumented. And it's so, you know, it's interesting too, because there is a problem with Latinidad, but Latinidad is also here to be a shorthand in the way in which, you know, Latinidad is there to collapse all of these identities, but it's these identities that make the thinker, right, the figure powerful. but then there's that the individualizing sort of energy animating, you know, I'm you know, super anxious about all of this. But the problem with Latinidad, a growing community of young Black and Indigenous people are questioning the very identity underpinning Hispanic Heritage Month. This appeared in the Nation last fall, 2019. I don't even think it's nationality. Those who can identify with Hispanic or Latinx are those who benefit from power because of language, race, and religion. Latinidad offers them a whole community, and then they become the ones at the top of it because they speak proper Spanish, they know their culture, and they come from a Christian or Catholic background, whereas people who are practitioners of curanderismo or santeria, who speak a bastard Spanish, who speak indigenous languages, or who come from other colonies in the Americas are erased from that identity. There's a privilege to being able to identify as Latinx and never be questioned about it. So, power.
I think it's interesting how they put together Hispanic and Latinx, and that starting with Octavio Paz, their criticisms are kind of similar of the ones that we had of Octavio Paz, which makes me wonder, do others in the group think that Latinx and Hispanic are closer than maybe we have thought? Or do you think that there's something like more space in between these terms than Salazar is recognizing?
I mean, I don't feel represented by any, like, none of the terms that are out there, and I think there's a conversation about specificity that excludes, and then when you start expanding it, it becomes ambiguous. How you say ambiguous in English?
Ambiguous?
Ambiguous, yeah, it becomes ambiguous. So I don't know. I've been reading Denise Ferreira da Silva's book recently, and in one of the assigned texts, somebody mentions it, and her construct of otherness. I feel there's a place there, but then it also is like too ambiguous. But in the way that the world has been structured with like nationalities and the definition of the transparent subject, then like everybody that is not a transparent subject, then it's another. I think that conversation is really is something that could be very fruitful in the way of like kind of like arming ourselves against or for something new or different, and maybe a new type of I mean, I think it's like a type of acceptance of our differences, and a way of like, you know, like understanding, you know, like I see you, you see me, and find some kind of like commonality in the differences. I think that would be like a really like fruitful thing. But I don't know. I mean, that's what.
Yeah, I also think that there's something really exciting about being a non-transparent subject, because it allows for a sort of possibility for fugitivity, for incoherence from the state, which has certain benefits, and then also doesn't have certain benefits at the same time. I'm thinking about specifically like the X and the way that the X is utilized in Latinx specifically. One of the things that Raquel and I were also talking about as we were fashioning this, all the readings together, was thinking outside of the terms of identity altogether towards questions of mobility. about, it's, for instance, it's not particularly useful sometimes to think about immigrants when we think about like a great swath of immigrant experiences. And so that there are certain kinds of mobilities or lack of mobilities that sticking to sort of like these identity terms doesn't account for. Raquel, did I butcher that?
Mm-hmm. No, you did not butcher that. No, I think no, that's correct. That's right. And also thinking about, you know, as listening to, what was your name? I know your last name is Beltran.
Ramon
Beltran. And thinking about the last 4 years, right? And we also had a brief pre-event conversation about how the problem of Latinidad has revealed itself, has revealed the toxicities, right? These last 4 years. And in some ways, I'm not interested in Latinidad. And my main interest in Latinidad is to reveal the desires, the whiteness in Latinidad. And my project is to recenter Blackness and indigenous practitioners, makers, projects, ideas, and to really explore sort of the dynamics, the relational dynamics, right, in every space. In Latinidad, I'm the white person. And I also feel like in some ways brownness is doesn't hold a critical weight in 2021 that it might have in 2013. So
yeah, I mean, for me, it's super problematic because I live in Puerto Rico and I'm Puerto Rican, and for Puerto Ricans living here, they have to deal with the whole scale, like the whole like color scale, and then like when they go to the US, there are others. There's no way of, but they're like really, but also that, you know, makes the possibility of somebody like, I don't know if you have been following the like Twitter account of Robert Unanue, the president of Goya Foods.
I was on his Twitter feed maybe 2 weeks ago, and I noticed that he didn't even have 350 followers, but that was my takeaway. But yeah, I think I know where you're going, Ramon. But
yeah, I mean, his statements about the U.S. becoming communist because.
Yes. That is last week. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And this person is Puerto Rican. Like how a place like Puerto Rico can produce that type of individual. You know, like tells you to the how complicated, I guess, all of this is, because this person, I imagine he identifies as Latino. At least in the US, he lived in Texas.
That's sorry, Texas. As a Texan, we can be real embarrassing.
Sure. It's those income taxes. So I think we should probably, in the interest of time, it's already a little after 7, so we can go into brownness. Risa, what do you think?
Yeah, let's do that.
I stop the share here.
I think that's a great segue from Ramon's interest in Denise Ferrar de Silva and the non-transparent. Okay, so here. Because I'm going to focus on a passage from Jose, the first line. I'm going to focus on the kind of like post-human aspects of the Brown Commons. So he writes, Brown Commons is meant to signify at least two things. One is commons of brown people, places, feelings, sounds, animals, minerals, flora, and other objects. How these things are brown or what makes them brown is partially the ways in which they suffer and strive together, but also the commonality of their ability to flourish under duress and pressure. So thinking beyond people to think about what Gerald Visner would call quality of survivance, if we were talking about Native American Indigenous studies, and bringing that into this quality of brownness. So they are brown in part because they are devalued by the world outside of their commons. Their brownness can be known by tracking the ways through which global and local forces constantly attempt to degrade their value and diminish their verve. But they are also brown insofar as they smolder with life and persistence. They are brown because brown is a common color shared by a commons that is of and for the multitude. Raquel, both you and I are people who use brown in our work. Brown has become, if I don't identify first as a Tejana, I probably am identifying as brown over Latinx. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about your choices, or please anybody from the audience?
Of course, yeah. I think of brown as this a destabilizer, right, to the fixed desires within a term like Latinx or Latino. I mean, Latino, Latinx feels like it makes sense for those of us who are, my dad's from Mexico, was from Mexico. My mom is from El Salvador. They met in East Los Angeles. And that feels, or, growing up, that has always felt too long to say, and that Latino is just a way to collapse that sort of origin story. But just in the ways in which Latino and Latinidad have become just like these toxic sort of signifiers for me in the Trump era, and gravitating towards a brownness represented by a particular swath of experiences and purveyors of like really radical practice in the work of Rafa Esparza, of the artists that I'm really just devoting my ekphrastic memoir to, Rafa, Sebastian Hernandez, and Sancha, these 4 Los Angeles-based artists who are informed by raspuachismo, queerness, nightlife, and a mode of celebratory extravagances of excess. And so brown has felt like the way to describe those excesses, or to at least, in reference to the limitations of the vessels, such as Latinidad.
I similarly have come to brown specifically because of the relationship to the land, and with that, a direct tie to questions of sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So I also have a background Native American Indigenous studies, and thinking, I'll talk about monarchs, was a way of thinking about how to make an exhibitions, which are in some cases place-based, without taking for granted the sort of like colonial settlement of certain geographies. Mm-hmm. So the path of the monarch butterfly allowed me to imagine an alternative way of interacting with the land and the landscape and geography outside of the terms of nationhood and settler colonial boundaries, and to think about a kind of expansive indigeneity than I think that demographic categories allow for. So it's also calling upon a sort of post-human to think about butterflies, but also to think about monarchs as also, a monarch is a person who has sovereign power, and to make those sort of connections together.
And as we're nearing our time together, and it'd be wonderful to just end on a few thoughts from the group here.
Also, this is also a moment we're very open to, like, just opening up to the conversation to anything. If you have questions for each other, questions for Raquel and I, about the nature of these readings or about this workshop, how we came this, about anything that you would want to share, we'd love to hear from you.
I just want to say I really appreciate this space. I feel like it's never enough time to talk about this. Like, I was just thinking about the casta system in Spain, and how there's that connection with the hyphenated American, right? And to me, my question is, like, who benefits from all these labels and all this division or assignments to all these different groups?
And the art history, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and I just want to say it's amazing just to be in conversation with many of you here from our positionality. Ramon in Puerto Rico, myself here in Tucson, most of you in Chicago, right? In Chicago, which has a really powerful, history with Mexican migration, the Bracero program, and the power. There's a lot of power in the Mexican community in Chicago that doesn't exist in places like California.
And the Puerto Rican community.
Of course.
Remember the kind of nationalist fronts that have been fought here in Chicago.
Of course.
I put this on, we don't have to talk about it, but I do think it's important to just briefly touch on Jared Sexton. I'm gonna highlight the one sentence, because what he's talking about is sort of anti-Blackness that's inherent in the phrase people of color. And I think that's something that we don't talk enough about, is the anti-Blackness within all of the communities that happens, whether we're calling them Chicano or Hispanic or brown. And the ways in which Jared Sexton gives language for articulating how it comes through here. So I think it was just really important to not skip that over. And I'll just leave it highlighted.
And I think also to think about our organizing relational curatorial practices around the concept idea of Latino, Latinidad, and the various sort of terms we've touched on here. They have to center Black people and Indigenous people. We can't do this again.
Yeah, there's something that Rafa says, and I think I quoted him, he talks about choosing brown because of the chromatic affinities with people who identify as Black. And so that brownness is also a way as a show of solidarity. I also want to say we're biased maybe towards this term. And I know that others may prefer others. And maybe I'm also really loved Ramon's comment about none of these terms are adequate. How many of you feel that way?
I wanted to bring up a sentence from the Monarchs text that I really liked, that really resonated with me, that said, identity is understood as personal, social, and relational, with different iterations of the self that vary in their articulation depending on with whom one is in conversation. And I just felt that sentence in particular addressed how I feel about, it's on page 23, I think, at the very top, addressed how I feel about identity in the sense that it's constantly shifting, constantly in motion, and that it may be, it may vary even in relation to whom I'm speaking to. It's, you know, it's a very malleable thing. And the last thing I wanted to say too was that I've been thinking a lot, and I know we can all go on forever about these things, but I've been thinking a lot about race and labels in the context of queerness as well for my particular identity, in thinking, you know, when I left Peru, feeling that I couldn't be queer there, which is what I thought when I was a teenager. I don't feel that way anymore. But now that I go back, I realized how, in my opinion, Peru is much more classist and racist than it is homophobic. That's not to say that it's not homophobic, but that my race would carry me farther than my sexual orientation. So my having lighter skin carried far more weight than my being gay or straight. And I've been thinking a lot about that, just what it means to how our racial identities collide with the other parts of our identities that make us a minority or a majority in other ways.
So much for your compliments. And it's really interesting to revisit this passage that you're pointing out in the context of Andozua, and to see she was kind of articulating what has a parallel to a sort of double consciousness. And it seemed like the difference between what I'm saying, what she's saying, is this sort of like, there's this 2-track for her. You're Indio when you're with brown people, and you're white when you're with white people, and you toggle between them. And I think that what I'm saying here is, no, you're constantly in flux, and that might be a sort of fugitivity. Like, I think I use the word entendre, like existing in multiplicity at all times, and that it's kind of like always a sort of negotiation in which you are maybe centered in or embodied in your position, but then also navigating questions of access.
Yeah, but even the text, the Mestiza text, at least the piece that you shared, doesn't mention race a whole lot. You know, at the bottom, it sort of talks about racial identity, but I really enjoyed it because it talks about a fluidity of being in a way that I found really parallel to how we talk about gender queerness too. Only at the bottom, she kind of gets into the specifics of racial identity.
Sure. Well, it's in the beginning of that chapter, the 4th chapter in Borderlands, that sort of does this unexamined invocation of the Vasconcelos Raza Cósmica thing that sets up the mestizo consciousness, and sets up the move towards the flux, ambiguity. And for me, I feel like there's also more useful mode of promiscuity, I think, of a genre promiscuity, conceptual promiscuity that feels more maybe apropos, or in the sense, I also think, you know, of the text is like, it's totally important, you know, there are some problems in it, but like 12-step, right? You take what you need and leave the rest, right? So, but I think it's a really powerful, I don't know, and it's problematic because of the way it just deploys raza, you know, and raza, another, I think still, we're not there yet in examining just the damage in that term. But thank you for your comments, Rafael, and for sharing that sort of the auto critique.
If that's okay, I'll jump in to wrap things up.
Sure.
Because I know that some can get a little tiring, even though this is such an important conversation to have, and only touching kind of the beginning of it. I feel like there's so much more to discuss. And thank you so much, Risa and Raquel, for your thoughtful preparation and for leading this conversation, and all of you really to joining. I think part of the idea to do this workshop was also to open up ourselves as the museum and using a particular term and just investigating more the issues with it and things that we can do to improve and keep working. Definitely more work to do. So thank you and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Unit, and thank you to DPAM, and thank you to all the artists. I know trying to make art and stay creative in the remote intimacies of the Zoom space are challenging. So I appreciate everyone showing up today.
And thank you so much for all the amazing things that you shared today. I really appreciate your vulnerability, your amazing ways you got into the text. I enjoy our conversation. I hope we get to talk some more later.
Thank you, Risa.
Bye, Raquel. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Unit.